The year is 1942, and the skies over Western Europe are ruled by the jagged, predatory silhouettes of the Luftwaffe. German pilots flying the lethal Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the butcher bird Focke-Wulf 190 sit in their cockpits with the confidence of apex predators. They are flying machines built like Swiss watches, light, agile, and deadly. Then the Americans arrived, and they bring with them something that makes the German pilots pause, stare, and then key their microphones to laugh. The first reports back to Luftwaffe headquarters in Berlin read like a joke. German reconnaissance pilots described a new American fighter that looked less like an airplane and more like a milk bottle with wings. It was the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. To the German aesthetic, which valued slim aerodynamic needles, the P-47 was a monstrosity. It was huge. It was, in fact, the largest, heaviest single-engine fighter ever built up to that point. Fully loaded, it weighed nearly 8 tons. A fully loaded Messerschmitt weighed barely 3. When Oberstlieutenant Walter Ossow, a highly decorated German ace, first saw the P-47s lumbering over the French coast, he reportedly mistook them for light bombers. They were simply too big to be fighters. The fuselage was deep and barrel-chested, housing a massive Pratt Whitney radial engine that looked like the open mouth of a basking shark. The mockery spread through the German mess halls like wildfire. The Luftwaffe pilots gave it nicknames. They called it the furniture van. They called it the flying bathtub. One captured German pilot, upon being interrogated by Allied officers, laughed and said, "It looks like you Americans tried to make a fighter plane out of a locomotive." The arrogance of the Luftwaffe was rooted in the laws of physics. In aerial combat, weight is usually the enemy. A heavy plane turns slowly. A heavy plane climbs sluggishly. A heavy plane is a target. The German pilots sitting in their nimble FW-190s believed they could fly circles around this American behemoth. They imagined the P-47 was a clumsy brawler that had wandered into a fencing match. There is a famous account from early 1943. A flight of FW-190s spotted a formation of P-47s cruising at high altitude near the Pas de Calais. The German leader signaled the attack, expecting an easy slaughter. He anticipated that the heavy American planes would be wallowing in the thin air, struggling to stay aloft. But as the Germans closed in, the laughter died in their throats. They noticed something impossible. The flying bathtubs were not struggling. They were cruising comfortably at 30,000 feet, an altitude where the German engines usually began to gasp for air. The P-47's massive size wasn't fat, it was muscle. Inside that bloated fuselage was a massive turbocharger system the size of a small car, feeding oxygen to the engine, allowing the giant to breathe where other planes choked. The German leader dove to attack, expecting the fat American plane to be slow. Instead, the P-47 pilot shoved his throttle forward, and the furniture van surged ahead with terrified speed. The laws of aerodynamics seemed to be suspended. The Americans weren't just flying a plane, they were flying a 2,000-horsepower engine with a cockpit attached to it. The skirmish ended indecisively that day. The Germans, confused by the speed of the giant, broke off. Back at their base, the mockery continued, but it was quieter now. They still joked about the ugly American plane that looked like a flying tank. They still called it a tub, but they had seen it move. They didn't know it yet, but the joke was on them. They were laughing at the design of their own executioner. The P-47 wasn't built to dance with them. It wasn't built to be pretty. It was built to endure. And soon the Germans would learn that while you can laugh at a bathtub, you cannot laugh at 8.50 caliber machine guns tearing your world apart at 400 miles per hour. The giant had arrived, and it was done playing games. To understand why the P-47 Thunderbolt was the size of a house, you first have to understand the mind of its creator, Alexander Kartveli. He was a Georgian immigrant with a philosophy that was entirely un-European. While the British and Germans were obsessed with drag coefficients and elegant lines, Kartveli was obsessed with one thing: altitude. The U.S. Army Air Corps came to him with a request. They didn't ask for a dogfighter. They asked for an interceptor that could fly at 40,000 feet and outrun anything in the sky. Kartveli did the math. To fly that high, an engine needs air, lots of it. At 30,000 feet, the air is thin. To keep an engine running, you need a massive turbocharger to force-feed oxygen into the cylinders. The turbocharger Kartveli selected was the size of a washing machine. The problem was, it got incredibly hot. He couldn't put it in the nose next to the engine or it would melt the pilot's feet, so he put it in the tail. This single decision dictated the entire shape of the plane. Kartveli had to design a complex system of ducting, massive pipes that ran from the engine in the front, under the pilot's seat, all the way to the turbocharger in the back, and then back up to the engine again. The P-47 wasn't just an airplane, it was a flying duct system. The fuselage had to be deep and wide just to hold the plumbing. This is why it looked like a milk jug. It was form following function in its most brutalist sense. At the front of this plumbing sat the heart of the beast, the Pratt Whitney R-2800 double wasp. It was an engineering masterpiece, an 18-cylinder air-cooled radial engine that pumped out 2,000 horsepower. It was so powerful that it required a four-bladed propeller that spanned 12 feet across. The engine block was so massive that it acted as a shield. A pilot could take a 20-millimeter cannon shell straight into the nose, and the R-2800 would simply absorb it, cough, and keep running. But Kartveli didn't just build a fast plane, he built one safe. He knew that this plane would be diving into the teeth of the German defense, so he over-engineered every bolt, rivet, and spar. The pilot sat in a cockpit that was surprisingly roomy. Pilots often joked that they could dodge bullets just by unbuckling their harness and running to the other side of the seat. But it was also a fortress. The pilot was protected by bulletproof glass in the front and a heavy steel armor plate behind his head. Beneath the plane, Kartveli installed a steel skid plate, so if the pilot had to make a wheels-up landing, the plane wouldn't tear apart, it would slide like a sled. The fuel tanks were self-sealing. If a German bullet punctured them, the rubber lining would swell up and plug the hole instantly, preventing the fires that turned Japanese Zeros into flying torches. The result was a machine that defied the delicate sensibilities of aviation. It weighed 13,000 pounds fully loaded. For context, the British Spitfire weighed roughly 6,000. When the first P-47s arrived in England, the RAF pilots looked at them with pity. They couldn't believe a thing that heavy could fly. But the American mechanics knew better. They knew they were working on a flying tank. There's a legendary story of a P-47 pilot who returned to base after hitting a chimney in occupied France. He didn't just clip it, he flew through it. He landed with bricks embedded in the leading edge of his wing. The plane was a wreck, but the pilot was alive. This was the genius of the monster. It wasn't designed to be graceful. It was designed to take a beating that would disintegrate a Messerschmitt and then turn around and fly its pilot home for dinner. The Germans might have laughed at the shape, but they were about to learn that you can't kill a tank with insults.
By the spring of 1943, the air war over Europe had reached a deadly stalemate. The German Luftwaffe, flying the agile Focke-Wulf 190, had learned a simple rule for fighting the Americans. If you get into trouble with a Spitfire, you dive. If you get into trouble with a P-47 Thunderbolt, you turn. They believed the P-47 was too heavy to maneuver and too clumsy to chase them down. For months, German pilots had used gravity as their escape hatch. When a lighter Allied plane tried to follow a German fighter into a high-speed dive, the Allied plane would often suffer from structural failure. Wings would rip off, or the controls would lock up due to air compression. The Germans knew that the P-47 weighed nearly twice as much as their own planes. They assumed that if they dove, the fat American plane would be left far behind, wallowing in the air. They were dead wrong. They had forgotten a fundamental law of physics: gravity loves mass. The turning point came with the arrival of Colonel Hubert Hub Zemke and his famous 56th Fighter Group, known as the Wolf Pack. Zemke was a tactician who understood that he couldn't fight the Germans on their terms. He couldn't outturn a Focke-Wulf. But he realized that the P-47's greatest liability, its massive 13,000-pound weight, was actually a storehouse of potential kinetic energy. Zemke drilled a new doctrine into his pilots that went against every instinct of a World War I dogfighter. "If a Jerry gets on your tail," Zemke told them, "do not turn. You will die. Push the stick forward. Drop like a stone." The Luftwaffe learned this lesson the hard way. Imagine the scene. An Oberlieutenant in an FW-190 spots a P-47 closing in. He does what he has always done. He rolls his plane inverted and pulls into a steep vertical dive, heading for the deck. He watches his altimeter spin: 20,000 feet, 15,000 feet, 10,000 feet. He expects to look in his rearview mirror and see the empty blue sky, the American plane having given up the chase. Instead, he looks back and sees a nightmare. The P-47 is not gone. It is right there, and it is getting bigger. What the German pilot was experiencing was the terrifying reality of terminal velocity. While the lighter German plane hit a wall of air resistance that slowed its acceleration, the P-47 was acting like a dropped anvil. Its sheer density allowed it to punch through the air resistance. The P-47 didn't flutter, it plummeted. In a dive, the Thunderbolt could exceed 500 miles per hour, speeds that were approaching the sound barrier. At these speeds, the air became hard as concrete. P-47 pilots reported that their control sticks would freeze solid due to a phenomenon called compressibility. The plane would shudder violently, threatening to tear itself apart. But the Thunderbolt was built like a bridge. Its rugged frame held together where other planes would have disintegrated. For the German pilot, the panic was absolute. He would push his throttle to the firewall, effectively pouring fuel into the engine to go faster, but it didn't matter. The laws of physics had decided the outcome. The huge, heavy American machine was converting its altitude into raw speed faster than the German engine could generate it. As the P-47 closed the distance, the American pilot didn't even need to be a sharpshooter. He just needed to get close. When he squeezed the trigger, 8.5 caliber machine guns unleashed a stream of lead. But at this diving speed, the bullets weren't just bullets, they were kinetic missiles. The combined speed of the diving plane and the muzzle velocity meant that when the rounds hit the fragile German fighter, the impact was catastrophic. Wings were sheared off, fuselages were sawed in half. By late 1943, a new order went out to the Luftwaffe fighter wings, a frantic directive from high command: never attempt to dive away from a Thunderbolt. The dive of death had changed the psychology of the war. The Germans realized that the P-47 wasn't just a heavy plane, it was a gravitational weapon. The Americans had figured out how to weaponize the very thing the Germans had mocked. The weight of the Thunderbolt was no longer a burden, it was the hammer that drove the nail into the coffin of the Luftwaffe. The flying bathtub had become the fastest falling object in the sky, and there was nowhere left to run.
By the summer of 1944, the character of the war had changed. The great dogfights in the stratosphere were fading.
The Luftwaffe had been broken. Its expert pilots dead were grounded by a lack of fuel. But for the average German soldier on the ground, the infantryman crouching in a foxhole, or the truck driver sweating behind the wheel of an Opel Blitz, the horror was not ending. It was descending. The P-47 Thunderbolt, the giant that had ruled the high altitudes, found its true calling in the mud and blood of the battlefield. It came down from 30,000 feet to 30 feet. The German soldiers had a word for it. They didn't call it the Thunderbolt. They whispered it with a mix of hatred and terrified respect. Jabo, short for Jagdbomber, fighter bomber. To understand the terror of the Jabo, you have to understand the sound. The P-47 was powered by an air-cooled radio engine, the Pratt Whitney R-2800. Unlike the high-pitched whine of the liquid-cooled Mustang or Spitfire, the Thunderbolt made a guttural, earth-shaking roar. It sounded like a freight train falling from the sky. For the Wehrmacht, the rules of survival had become simple and brutal. You do not move during the day. The sun belongs to the Americans. The daylight belongs to the Jabo. A German supply officer captured in the Falaise pocket described the psychological paralysis. "We could not move a single vehicle," he told his interrogators. "If a truck engine started, a Thunderbolt would appear. They seemed to be everywhere, waiting for us to make a mistake." The P-47 was no longer just a fighter. It was flying artillery. Because of its massive size and engine power, it could carry an absurd amount of ordnance. A single P-47 could carry 2,500 pounds of bombs and rockets, roughly half the payload of a B-17 Flying Fortress strategic bomber. But unlike a B-17 dropping from the clouds, the Thunderbolt delivered its hate personally, at eye level. The tactics were ruthless. A flight of 4 P-47s would spot a German column trying to sneak through a French country road. They wouldn't just drop bombs, they would dissect the column. First, they would strafe the front vehicle and the rear vehicle, trapping the convoy. Then, the slaughter would begin. The pilots would unleash the Sunday punch. This was the devastating combination of 8 50-caliber machine guns firing simultaneously. These weren't rifle bullets. They were thumb-sized slugs of armor-piercing incendiary lead. When a P-47 opened fire on a soft target like a truck or a horse-drawn cart, the target didn't just break, it evaporated. The kinetic energy of the bullets would physically shred metal, wood, and flesh, turning the vehicle into a cloud of splinters and fire. But the true nightmare for the heavy German armor was the HVAR, the high-velocity aircraft rocket. These were 5-inch rockets mounted under the wings. German Tiger and Panther tanks were terrifying beasts, heavily armored in the front, but the P-47 didn't fight fair. The pilots would dive at steep angles, firing rockets that struck the thin top armor of the tanks, or they would use ricochet tactics, firing their machine guns into the road in front of the tank so the bullets would bounce up into the soft underbelly of the machine. The devastation was total. In the retreat across France, the roads became graveyards of twisted metal. The highway of death near Rancy became a testament to the Jabo terror. Miles of burned-out German equipment, tanks turned upside down by the force of explosions, and horses lying dead in the traces. It was dangerous work. Flying at treetop level meant the P-47s were flying directly into the teeth of the German flak, anti-aircraft fire, and small arms. But this is where the legend of the flying bathtub was cemented. The P-47 could absorb punishment that would have disintegrated a P-51 Mustang. Pilots came back with cylinders blown off their engines. They came back with holes in their wings big enough for a man to crawl through. They came back after flying through the debris of the trains they had just exploded. One famous photo from the era shows a P-47 that had hit a telephone pole while strafing. The pilot had sliced the pole in half with his wing and flown home with the wood still embedded in the metal. By the end of the war, the German army was walking home. They had no trucks, no fuel, and no tanks. The P-47 had systematically dismantled the logistics of the Wehrmacht.
The German soldiers who surrendered looked at the sky with a twitchy nervousness. They knew that the true king of the battlefield wasn't the tank or the infantryman. It was the roaring, indestructible giant that lived in the treetops.
If the P-47 Thunderbolt was a hammer, its 8.5 caliber machine guns were the anvil. To understand the sheer violence of this aircraft, you have to look at the wings. Most fighters of World War II, the Spitfire, the Messerschmitt, the Zero, carried a mix of light machine guns and maybe one or two heavy cannons with limited ammunition. They were fencers designed to strike with precision. The P-47 was not a fencer. It was a firing squad. Embedded in its massive wings were 8 Colt Browning M2 machine guns. When a pilot squeezed the trigger, he wasn't just firing bullets, he was unleashing a physics experiment in destruction. The guns fired at a combined rate of over 6,000 rounds per minute. That is 100 heavy-caliber bullets every single second. The recoil was so powerful that if a pilot fired a long burst while flying level, the sheer backward force of the guns would physically slow the 7-ton plane in midair, acting like an air brake. The effect on a target was horrifying. American pilots reported that when they caught a German fighter in the convergence point of all 8 guns, the enemy plane didn't just catch fire, it disintegrated. The 8 pillars of fire acted like a chainsaw. Wings were sheared off at the root. Fuselages were literally sawed in half in midair. There was no need for explosive shells. The kinetic energy of that much lead hitting a lightweight aluminum frame simply erased the structure of the enemy aircraft. But if the firepower made the P-47 dangerous, its survivability made it a legend. The Thunderbolt was built with a philosophy that was unique in the U.S. Army Air Forces. The pilot is expensive, the metal is cheap. The liquid-cooled engine of a P-51 Mustang was fragile. A single stray bullet into the radiator would drain the coolant, overheat the engine, and force the pilot to bail out within minutes. The P-47, however, used the Pratt Whitney R-2800 radial engine. It was air-cooled. It had no radiator to puncture. It was a massive block of hardened steel protecting the pilot. The stories of survival border on the mythical. The most famous incident involved Robert S. Johnson, one of the top American aces of the war. On June 26, 1943, Johnson's P-47 was shot to pieces. A German Focke-Wulf 19 caught him in a trap. 20mm cannon shells tore through his hydraulic system, blew off his canopy, and severed his control cables. His plane was a burning wreck tumbling through the sky. Johnson managed to regain some control, limping toward the English Channel, but he wasn't alone. A German ace, Egon Meyer, pulled up behind the crippled Thunderbolt. Meyer knew the American was a sitting duck. He lined up his sights and opened fire. Bullets raked the fuselage of the P-47. The rudder was shredded. The metal skin was peeled back like a tin can, but the plane kept flying. Meyer was confused. He circled around, lined up again, and poured more lead into the P-47. He targeted the cockpit and the engine. The P-47 shuddered, bits of metal flying off into the slipstream, but the engine kept roaring. For minutes, the German ace used the P-47 for target practice. Finally, Meyer pulled up alongside Johnson. He looked at the flying wreck. He looked at the American pilot, huddled in the cockpit, covered in hydraulic fluid and blood. Meyer shook his head in disbelief. He had run out of ammunition. The P-47 refused to die. The German pilot rocked his wings in a salute of bewildered respect and peeled away. When Johnson finally belly-landed back in England, the ground crew stopped counting the holes. The plane had taken 21 direct hits from 20mm explosive cannon shells and over 200 hits from machine guns. One propeller blade was half gone. The engine cylinder heads were blown off. The tail hung by a thread. Any other plane in the world would have been a smoking crater in a French field. The Thunderbolt brought him home. This was the ultimate legacy of the unkillable juggernaut. It wasn't the prettiest plane, it wasn't the most agile,
but to the mothers of the thousands of pilots who walked away from crashes that should have killed them, it was the most beautiful machine ever built. The Germans could shoot it, they could blast it, and they could curse it, but they could not bring it down.